haven't. I have to test just before we go on.
Oh, for holiday.
Well, I've got double vaccinated. But we swapped GPs finally to Wallingford, and they've lost me.
Oh no. So when have you got to have that?
Up at 7 o'clock.
Tomorrow night?
Yeah, it's fine.
Okay, where's that?
We're only on at 8:30.
Yeah, we're on at 8:30. Where is it at?
I had Joe on the phone, it's fine.
Oh, okay. Oh, okay. So,
It's just all a bit...
yeah. Are you in trouble as well for...
No, God, no.
Like, I just worked with Claire's, like, trying to get ready to go on holiday, and you'd, like, doing
Claire
2
will be
nights...
packing at 3 o'clock in the morning.
2 nights in a row. Away.
Like, for home life, she's the world's most disorganised person.
Okay. It's a slightly unfortunate timing. So what time are you going on Saturday?
Hey?
What time are you going on Saturday on your holiday?
About 4 in the morning.
So we're doing this thing at 8:30 tomorrow night, and then he's going on holiday at 4 in the morning.
4 in the morning, nice.
That's pretty bright. I can't believe that guy played against us in Cups final.
Really?
So, he was the teacher.
Okay, good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming. And it's really great to do our first in-person event at Fitz in this academic year. And it's really great to be back, and everybody physically back in the community. And welcome to those who are watching on live stream as well. So hello to everybody out there in the ether. This evening we're going to talk about sport, and sport's been a really crucial part of life here in Fitzwilliam. And not just in terms of the big wins at the highest levels, but also, I'm pleased to say, those plenty of occasions when people have got involved on a mass participation basis across the college. And it's a great way in which our students and other members of the college community have been able to balance those pressures of academic work and balance that out in relation to well-being and also participating as a member of a team, for example, and it enables them to meet other members of the Fitz community. And for me, I'm a new member here, running's my passion, and a couple of weeks ago I was part of the Fitz Flyers team in the Chariots of Fire relay race in the city, and that's just an illustration of how we all come together to celebrate being part of this community. So tonight's event really speaks to the importance of sport and active participation that lies behind a lot of what Fitz is about as a community. And all three of our panel came to Fitz, I understand, in the early 90s and were keen participants in the sporting life of the college then. So I look forward to hear about some of their stories during the evening. And I just want to spend a couple of minutes talking about our panel. Firstly, Kerry, an associate features editor at the Evening Standards magazine ES, and formerly a deputy editor at ELLE magazine. Kerry spent 2 decades writing about health, fitness and lifestyle for national newspapers and magazines such as the Sunday Telegraph and the Times. She also curates and presents events and is a content consultant for a number of lifestyle brands. Tom is currently the director of a research and teaching centre on climate change and sustainability and development at SOAS University of London, and he left Fitz, interestingly, to assist in managing the beef of Baron in town. Oh, Baron of Beith, that's right, sorry. From where he secured scholarships to visit power stations for a master's and explore the Andes in the name of a PhD. He became a climate negotiator and policy advisor for the first for the UK and then the Bangladeshi governments, before embarking on an academic career centred on adapting and building resilience in changing climate. And he would like you to know that he doesn't excel at sports, including volleyball and tennis. And that brings us to Matt, who will chair the conversation this evening and is the co-founder with his wife Claire, also a Fitz 93 alum, of Two Circles, the fastest growing sports agency in the UK over the last decade. Matt is a non-executive director of the English Institute for Sport, delivering technology and sports science to Britain's Olympic and Paralympic teams, and presents a sports business podcast for industry-leading platform Sports Pro. So, I'm delighted to welcome you all to Fitz at this first physical gathering of the academic year, and what I will hope will be a really interesting conversation. Over to you, Matt.
All mics are good. This is definitely not the first physical gathering of the academic year in terms of the level of academic debate you're going to hear today, but we'll do our best to colour in some of the things we think are changing in the world of sport and world of exercise. Some of you, well, all of you, I imagine, were probably expecting us to have 4 people here as opposed to 3. Dan Rowan, the BBC sports editor, sends his profuse apologies. I can't say too much because I think he's on the news at 10 tonight on a story which reverberates around the acquisition of a Premier League club and some people coming into town that he's had the chance to get an exclusive interview of for the news at 10. Far be it for any of us to stand in the way of that, but does send his apologies. I know he'd be committed to come down and say some words here sooner rather than later, because he was actually a fantastic part of the sporting community when he was here. I was first team skipper for football when I was here in '95, and he was third team skipper at the time and a fantastic part of this sports community. And everything you hear him talk about in terms of, and everything you hear him probe on, News at 10, if you're back in time tonight, are things that he believes, which is why he asks the questions he asks and makes the challenges to British sport that he does. But nevertheless, we have 3 of us here who are going to lead the line today. And I thought it was worth saying that we probably have had this debate before. So we probably have had a rehearsal to this debate, but it was probably about 1995 when we had it. And we probably had a couple of beers. You have to excuse us if we don't remember the exact detail. And the truth is, in the last 25, 26 years, this place, Fitz, and sports have both changed beyond all measure. So just to, if you'll indulge me for a minute, just to kind of wheel the clock back to what seems only not a very long time ago that we were all here. You know, in 1996, Prime Minister was John Major, who was also one of the foremost members of the home of cricket, the MCC at the time, which says a lot about British government at the time, also says a lot about cricket at the time, actually. I managed to get my whole way through a languages degree here without a single use of a PC. I was slightly bleeding edge because I had a word processor in my 4th year. And in order during finals term to get a sense of what the score was at Wimbledon or at the cricket, I had either to listen to the radio or to go to the JCR to see what was on telly. That was the era when there was actually still some sport on terrestrial telly, because you weren't getting Sky Sports on the Fitz TVs at that point. 1996 was also the year that Britain was 36th in the Olympic medal table, with our 1 gold medal. Of course, as we were finishing off, Euro '96 was around the corner. and Gaza and sort of sport almost becoming a little bit more mainstream, a little bit more acceptable maybe, apart from some of Gaza's antics on the sidelines. And I guess I say that in the context of male football becoming very mainstream, and Kerry was a big social part of the women's football setup at Fitz. And women's football at Cambridge at the time actually was a little bit of an underground sport. And that might seem a bit strange, but actually if you think about it, women's football had only actually been legal in England for 25 years when we were at uni. It was banned for an awful long time for reasons we may or may not go into. And it's definitely the case that way back then, ball sports were sports, really. A little bit running, a little bit of Olympic and Paralympic sports for sure, but really it was a ball sport world, and that notion of if you were sport, it was a badge of honour, was very true. I mean, certainly I remember with Tom having far too many conversations in the Fitz bar discussing whether darts was a sport or snooker was a sport, as if that was a badge of honour. Because if you weren't a sport, then somehow you weren't legitimate, and we'll chat a little bit maybe about how that might be changing, particular for future current younger generations than any of us. And as I was leaving uni, last thing I'll say, in sort of opening remarks, was I was leaving uni. It was Glastonbury had started to be covered on BBC. Started to be covered live on the BBC, and I'm a big music fan as well as a sports fan. And Oasis were kind of the main act on the Saturday night on the main stage at Glastonbury, who effectively drunk their way to celebrity and being on that front stage. And there's a real contrast, I think, in terms of think about the social context that we're in now with entertainment more broadly. You know, you have Oasis on the main stage having drunk their way and taking drugs to the main stage at Glastonbury then, much as I loved them and admired them at the time. And now you've got Stormzy, who also heads the main stage at Glastonbury wearing a stab-proof vest as a social comment. So our world has changed in so many different ways, and sport has been both catalyst and recipient of those changes, and some of those things we're going to look to get into a little bit here. I guess quickly, to both of you, start with Kerry. I'm always going to start with Kerry, if that's all right. No offence, mate. Tom was actually the lead guitarist at the band we put together for my wedding, so he's good on music trivia as well.
They're not going to play, don't worry.
We're not going to play. That drum kit is just a fib in the main outside the auditorium. Kerry, your journey and experience of sport, so from Fitz to where we are today.
Right, well, as you mentioned, I played football when I was here. I used the word played in quite a loose way. I mean, Matt was always very immersed in sport and has obviously gone on to work in sport, but I was much more of a fair weather. I mean, for me, playing women's football, it was much more about the social aspect of it at the time, and it was a way to make friends. I mean, we didn't take it particularly seriously, and Matt coached our team for a while, and I think it really irritated him because he took it a lot more seriously. But you know, it was the 90s. There was a lot of hedonism going on. We'd go out all night, and then I'd go straight and play football matches on a Saturday or Sunday morning.
She was never particularly keen on heading it. I could never work out
why.
No.
And I tell you what, though, it was a really good way to get rid of a hangover, but sweat it out. But you know, you know, I was never going to be an elite athlete, to say the least. But it was a central part of my college, my time in college, and I have extremely fond memories. And as I say, it was about the social aspect, and I don't think at the time we thought about sport in terms of what it could do for our brains as well as our bodies, but there wasn't, the word well-being I don't think had really been invented then, but looking back I definitely think it brought some balance to my life amid the studying and the kind of going out. It brought something else and gave me some headspace. So that was my time at Fitz, and then after that I'd never played football again really properly. We all moved to London, and it was just, there just weren't the women's football. It just wasn't a thing. So I'm kind of sad about that, although I do play now with my kids. And I kind of, you know, sport and exercise has been a part of my life, but probably like the average person, not absolutely central to it all. And I've actually found that in my 20s and 30s, it was sort of bubbling along in the background, but it's not since I got to my 40s that it's become much more important to me. And I'm a runner. I'm sure some of you are as well. And for me, it's the meditative quality of running. It's a problem-solving thing for me. It's the only time in my life that I'm ever on my own. No one's asking me to do anything. I'm not answering emails. So I've found, sort of in my later years, it's become much more important. And I play tennis, and I do yoga, and I go to the gym, and I kind of actually, at this point in my life, do much more sport than I ever have done, really. And I have sporty children, and I think you look on sport differently when you have children as well, and you can see the benefits that it brings to them and to their lives. And I kind of think Matt and I have been wrote the book during the pandemic, didn't we? It was a lockdown project, which was, I did sometimes wonder if we'd bitten off more than we could chew, because we've both got children around the same age, and who didn't go to school for the best part of a year. So we were trying to write a book and concentrate on that, as well as homeschooling our children and dealing with everything else that was going on in the pandemic. But I think when all of that sport had been taken away, we couldn't do any of the things we'd normally do apart from running. I think that really brought into sharp relief just how important activity was, really, which is a kind of central theme of the book, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so together we wrote a book called All to Play For, How Sport Can Reboot Our Future, which really takes a pretty holistic look at sport and exercise and play, and tries to reframe the role it might play in society going forward. We'll say a bit more about some of those themes as we go through the evening. And clearly climate and the way in which towns are changing our town. We live in the same neck of the woods, has changed beyond all measure in the last 3-4 years. Is a big part of that. Very conscious that we were the lucky ones living in the countryside during the COVID pandemic, because although we had no desire to teach our kids the fronted adverbial, so escaped and wrote a book and went running together, actually we were the lucky ones, and a lot of people whose sporting habits were taken away from them during that period. And for the book, one of the people we had a chat to was my mate Tom here, Fitz, league-winning goalkeeper, amongst hiding your light under a bushel on the sporting sentiment. But I guess for us, just dawning probably on both Kerry and I, the impact of some of the challenges we're handing down to future generations, not least around climate and sort of urban context. So to have Tom here as well was great. And your world, from playing cricket in Bangladesh, playing tennis in Bangladesh, to football at Fitz, how does your sporting journey coincide?
I came from childhood, certainly sport being quite an elite thing, and never being quite good enough to make the first teams that would be the way you got the attention. So at school you were either good in the first team or you were not, and you weren't catered for. And then I think bringing that, so I played a lot of badminton. I played in a badminton club that was outside of school. I played in goal, at football, certainly at like Cub Scout level. But then it kind of, it drops away, as it often does in those mid-teenage years, not just for girls, but a lot of boys as well. And when I came to Fitz, it was that sporting culture. It was really nice to come to a place that I think it was always described as, well, it's more of a comprehensive school, and therefore it's got people who play football instead of rugby. But that's not entirely true. But it had a reputation for being good at football, and there was a real football culture. As you say, there was more than one women's football team. Certainly the only college with more than one women's football team. Certainly 3 men's teams that played regularly. People would play out on the park. We were just saying before that we would play out on the field out the back, and it would be afternoon games of 5-a-side, and it would be men and women. That was fairly normal. And I started doing taekwondo in the hall because the university taekwondo squad met here. I had never done it before. I just thought, I'm fairly tall and skinny. This looks like fun. And it was, for me, sport's about, I need to be held accountable. I need to have a training session that I have to go to. Otherwise, voluntarily, I won't do it. So I've always joined clubs, and that's that, as we've said, that social side of the sports clubs that's been really important. And I think the book touches really well on this, the change within schools for all the challenges that they have now on sports provision. That this sense of it's good for everyone. Doing sport is about inclusion and, you know, trying to get everyone to do it. And I think the emphasis on well-being, or at least the understanding of the well-being benefits, and even the instrumental benefits of being better at concentrating in class, weren't something that we were familiar with at all. And it really was, you know, if you weren't good, you were just one of the ones who could just go and get, you know, off you go and do cross country, you know, get out of our way while we teach the good people to do the sport well. And you had the brutal PE teachers, you know, ex-army PE teachers. It was all that, you know, that was my experience. So the book charts that well, and and the change, I think, to what we see now in the new generation of sport, and touches well on where it might go in the future and the challenges it faces.
And I guess underneath that, so my career, as you heard, was in sort of the commercial, if you like, side of sports and entertainment. And having left the business I co-founded with my wife 10 years ago. Didn't leave my wife, just left the business. We both left it at the same time. Get in trouble if she's watching. I've been lucky through the experiences I've had. So I support a charity that works with using exercise in primary schools to help kids concentrate and feel happier about their studies. I'm also involved with the performance side of sport, and I'm involved in the commercial side. And putting all that together was the reason for wanting to write the book, really, because I thought I was seeing real seeds of progress pre-COVID. I was starting to see a bunch of things that made me, personally, and when I talked to Kerry about it, made her as well, feel really actually very optimistic about what the next piece of the jigsaw puzzle might have. So hopefully the rest of this will be a fairly feel-good session. We're going to chat for about 20 minutes or so and then open the floor up. So do have a think about some questions. It would be ideal if we could find some people down here and then up there, because Nicola's put her high heels on, especially to be challenged. So if we can think of some diverse questions, that'd be great. What are the things that you see, Tom, in your working world, in and around climate and urban regeneration, that make you think about the role that sport could play? Keep it really open.
Well, I think the first is that for all the conversation people had with me, and it's always about the carbon footprint, right? It seems to come down to carbon footprint. There's an obsession now with the carbon footprint of X, Y, and Z. Whereas for me, it's about the broader remit of sustainability, around environmental protection, and incentivising better stewardship of the environment. So, you know, look, I see a lot of positives from sport. You touch in the book on the regeneration of areas where you have new stadia built, often, you know, pushed onto brownfield sites intentionally, so the bioremediation of those sites, which are basically too polluted to build on, is something that is the planning gain, as it's called, that, you know, is an ancillary benefit of making that stadium. And the
Olympic Park is one of those, of course.
The complete rejigging of the Olympic Park. I mean, we talk, so I work a lot on with urban planners, and they talk about land use value capture. So basically, if you invest in the land itself, so whether for me that's flood resilience generally, but actually, you know, remediating that site, getting rid of the toxins that were in the soil, and that costs an absolute bomb. That's what I did my master's degree on, and it costs, you know, incredible amounts of money. But of course, the benefit you get in terms of the land values going up easily outweighs that. You just need that upfront capital cost. And a lot of stadia, and the Olympic Park, as the entire, you know, regeneration of that entire area of East London shows, it can really have some benefits. And you've got an ongoing, like, environmental management plan in that area that is really rejuvenating that and is seeing it through, you know, seeing the plants through to maturity that were planted there in time for the 2012 Olympics. So I'm optimistic about the role of sport, and try not to dwell too much just on how terrible the carbon footprints are, although I can obviously talk about that at length.
Tom is, if you get a chance to have a look at the book, Tom's not a fan of golf, but missed out air sport. What do you call it?
Air sports, yeah. I basically said in the book, I said that golf was like the worst sport environmentally, which I think is true if you talk about mass participation sports. But of course, there is a whole sporting network around jumping out of aeroplanes and use of aeroplanes to aeronautic sports like skydiving competitions and so on that are far worse.
We are, of course, a generation that's that's racked with guilt in terms of some of the challenges we've created in our environmental view of the world that we're handing on slightly awkwardly. And I guess, Kerry, what leads you to feel positive about some of the generational change you see more broadly in sport? Because
yeah, I mean, we did a deep dive in the book, didn't we, into the different generations' attitudes to sport and health and fitness, and it was quite cheering, wasn't it? And I think to touch on what Matt said earlier, one of the things we've looked at is the kind of younger people have a real kind of lack of, they're not interested in boundaries around lots of different things at the moment, but sport is one of them, and this idea of, is something a sport, is it legit, you know, they just don't really care so much. It's all about playing and having fun. And an example from my own family, my son is 10 and he's football obsessed, but he's obsessed with playing his traditional matches and going to training. He's also obsessed with the F2, who are, I don't know if any of you have seen them on YouTube, they're kind of football freestylers. They're these two guys who just do amazing tricks. It's not competitive, it's just really, really good fun to watch. And for him, there's not really any distinction there between proper football and kind of playing around. And I think that's great, because I think not everyone wants to play, you know, not everyone wants the kind of structure of matches. Not everyone can not everyone has the parents who can take them to matches, who can buy them all the kit and that kind of thing. So I think the kind of those boundaries coming down kind of will probably help children be more active, or more children come into activity. And we looked a lot about bringing people in from the margins. And another thing that came up was esports, wasn't it? Which I hadn't even heard the phrase esports when I started writing this book. And Matt enlightened me, because it turns out my children are playing them and I don't even really know that that's what they're doing. But with a lot of the gaming they're doing, you know, with FIFA and that kind of thing, that to them, that's sport, that's play. And I think our generation have the tendency to kind of go, oh my goodness, that's on a screen, that's bad, because we all worry about the amount of time we spend mindlessly scrolling through our phones. So if we see our children doing that kind of thing, we don't like it. But actually, they, you know, that brings some benefits as well, doesn't it? And it kind of, as long as it's kind of controlled, you know, within boundaries, and they're doing other things. So we were sort of talking, well, it can't really be a sport because it doesn't get your heart pumping. And Matt pointed out, well, actually it does, you know, it does do that. It does raise children's pulses, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I was talking to somebody from Charity Laureus yesterday who was saying that they've just run a big study in Chicago with kids playing electronic games, sounding old, playing esports. And what they found was actually, if you can keep them together, engaging with that, either digitally or in a physical room, actually some of the emotional, psychological benefits of that, just talking to other people, engaging with other people, are just as strong as they would be sat in a football changing room. It's just you're lacking the physical exercise piece.
And to be honest, during part of when we were kind of in the real depths of, is lockdown ever going to end? Are my children ever going to be allowed to see their friends ever again? That gaming was the only social part of their lives they had. I mean, we took them out for walks and bike rides, but in terms of, you know, talking to their peers, it actually came in quite useful. So that kind of helped me reframe the way I think about what constitutes sport, and just kind of relax a bit.
Yeah, and I think that notion was why we call it All to Play For, and sport was in the subtitle, because our view would be that this obsession with is it sport or is it not is redundant, and my son would view that, 14, would view that as a redundant question actually. If something is engaging, you do it with your friends, it's fun and it's social, and it gets your heart moving, then that should be good enough for us. And actually trying to put our millennial Gen X definitions on things that younger generations are engaging with is absolutely redundant, just as redundant as trying to say that the 100 isn't an exciting cricket competition because the overs have each over has more or less balls in it. That's just putting old frames of reference onto new things, and theirs, happily, is the future. There are a few other things, actually, that we felt pretty positive about in terms of the role of sport and exercise. I mentioned earlier on the organisation that helped them in terms of education in primary schools. And one of the things they're able to do now is measure the impact of some of those interventions, so they can show that there's a little game they run with called classroom cross country. They just get the kids kind of pretending to be in a cross country running race when they're just before they do a maths lesson. So bank right, bank left, jump down, go over a fence, that kind of stuff. And they measure the impact of doing that just for a minute and a half before a maths lesson in terms of how well behaved the kids are during the lesson, how much that sinks in, how much the job satisfaction the teachers get as a result of that. I've done that in the whole of West Dorset. And lo and behold, the impact of that jigging around stupidly on the chair for 90 seconds is marked in terms of all of those barometers. You can also now measure the impact of your nutrition and exercise on all sorts of other things in terms of your own health. So when I stepped back from 2 Circles about a year ago, the reality was it had been 6 days a week for 9 years. I was utterly burnt out. And what that meant was my immunity system was pretty shot. Had to work really hard to sort of manage my diet, manage my sleep, things like that, just to try and get myself back on the straight and narrow and stop picking up every single cold I got. I used this to do it. It was like a ring, basically. It's called an Aura ring, which is measures all that kind of stuff. It's like a wearable, I guess, is the funky name for it. And as a result of doing that, it was about 400 quid 5 years ago, about 200 now. The cost of this kind of stuff, where I can now check first thing in the morning all those metrics on my body to check I'm moving in the right direction, the cost of doing that has reduced markedly. And so I can sense and notice the impact of me running in the morning on my immunity system. Right? And if anyone who knows anything about how technology cost changes, 500 quid 5 years ago, 200 quid now is going to be 30, 20 quid in a couple of years' time. And all of a sudden that becomes a metric the NHS can use and prescribe a lot more effectively than prescribing drugs for symptoms and problems. I also realised as a result of that I was pre-diabetic. And so trying to manage my diet in a way, every 3 months I use a live blood test piece of kit that's about 20 quid, and start slowly trying to wean myself out of diabetes. And they're things that any of us in a couple of, I'm lucky, I've got slightly more disposable income than average, but so all of us will be able to do in a few years' time. And that completely changes our ability to prove that exercise helps, prove that nutrition helps, and be able to measure that, take responsibility for that ourselves, as opposed to kind of hope that the NHS, which is, if you haven't noticed, extremely cash-strapped, is going to be able to do to help us along the way. What are cities that we play sport in going to look like in 5 years' time, given that if I took a walk down Cambridge High Street this evening, and I reckon there's about 30% the number of pubs there were than we were here. I saw far more people running. I saw a lot of boarded up shops. What does that mean for the role that sport might be able to play in Cambridge in 5 to 10 years' time, and indeed every other high street like ours, where we've got more shops boarded up than we know what to do with?
Well, the first thing I guess to point out is that this isn't the average, city in the world. So the picture of the biggest cities in the world is one of mass expansion. It is reduced green space, and that is really detrimental to the ability to exercise outdoors. And the other thing is, of course, that these mega cities are heavily urban, heavily polluted, and so that the impact of, there was a brilliant study. I was living in Delhi for the last 3 years, just moved back to the UK, and it's just was pushed out because of the air pollution, and the expansion of these cities is just so big that the huge investments in transport networks that are needed can't stem the car growth, which is basically pushed by consumer aspiration, essentially. It's an aspirational thing. So as an aside, in India, when they introduced the first $1,000 car, Tata Motors, it really didn't sell very well. Because people are like, I don't want the worst car in the country. And they got it complete, they got them marketing completely wrong. people do want to move around in cars, so that's a problem for cities. So aside from the kind of urban sphere in the UK, which is actually not changing anywhere near as rapidly as that in the global south, where cities are still expanding incredibly rapidly. You know, there's about 55% of the world's population is living in towns and cities now. That's projected to go up to 70% by mid-century. That's what I see as the real problem. It's the actual spaces to do sport in those cities being reduced. So in the UK, I think there's a kind of bit of a sport revival. There are problems, obviously, with accessibility. You know, we know school playing fields being sold off and people being priced out of the ability to do sport. That's my chief concern.
Right.
I think provision is good, but it's been privatised and, you know, pushed beyond the reach of, you know, anyone below the average wage. Essentially, it's getting expensive to do sport. And
because that, I mean, we found that during COVID period, right? So, yeah, it's all very well for us to kind of get our other halves to look after the kids and then nip out for a run at 9 o'clock because we have fairly flexible working hours. But, you know, if you're working between 9 and half 5, it's not safe to run.
Yeah.
And you've had it.
Yeah.
There is no exercise.
I mean,
then you've got Joe Wicks or nothing.
Yeah, I think the data shows that during the pandemic, the fit got fitter, and the, you know, and then everyone else kind of got less fit. So I think we recognise what a privileged position we were in. Also, not everyone can run or wants to run or has a bike or wants to ride a bike. I mean, we had very, very limited options. You know, what happens if you're a swimmer? People couldn't swim for a year.
It's easy to get out of those habits, right?
Yeah, well, that's the other problem as well. I mean, my daughter is an elite gymnast. Her gymnastics club closed down. COVID just did for it. And that was a huge part of her life, and we've had to kind of find her a new club, and, you know, and obviously we've been able to do that, and I can pay the fees, but you can see why people drop out.
So in that, one of the other things that happened, though we're jumping around a bit now to give some time for questions, one of the other things that happened during the COVID period was, inverted commas, was the government understandingly trying to manage a load of unprecedented stuff and making some wrong turns as well as some right ones. And against that backdrop, some of that social divide was pointed out not by the opposition, but by a professional footballer. Right? So, and you're sort of certainly more than either of us, sort of living in that world of noticing how celebrities influence culture daily. What was going on there, do you think? And is that likely to be what we'll see going forward?
I think so. I mean, I think obviously the thing with Marcus Rashford, I think part of it is a symptom of our times and the generational stuff we were talking about earlier. You know, we're living in more serious times. People are more serious. People's lives are more serious. There's more jeopardy. So I think, you know, I think we have a massive problem with a vacuum of trust in authorities and institutions. And I think athletes, sort of activism, the athletes have obviously got platforms. This social media has come through and given these superstars of of various games more, you know, more leverage and bigger platforms than they've ever had before. And you get someone like Marcus Rashford coming through, who basically gets the government to feed poor children during the pandemic. And I think that is a brilliant thing. I think you will see more and more of it. I mean, it just, you know, it's such an anathema to think of, you know, the people who were huge when we were here. You know, I couldn't imagine Gaza launching a big social campaign. I mean, we've moved on so much. I also think these elite athletes have got very savvy managers. They kind of know the right things to say. It's important to have this stuff as part of your portfolio, as part of your marketing strategy as well. But to be slightly cynical about it, you know, that is part of it. But generally, it's a brilliant thing. You've got Maro Itoje, the rugby player as well, who Gavin Williamson very embarrassingly mixed the two of them up. I don't know if you remember, a couple of weeks ago, mixed up Marcus Rashford. But Maro works, you know, he's campaigning about the digital divide. You've got Marcus Rashford doing food, Maro doing the digital divide. You've got Joe Wicks, obviously brilliant reach, kind of getting children active during lockdown. And I interviewed Joe Wicks during lockdown for my day job on the Evening Standard. And one thing he said that really sort of stuck with me is that he designed those workouts for kids. I don't know if any of you did them, but we were doing them with our children, weren't we? And my husband still does them. He's like the biggest Joe Wicks fan in our family. The children don't do it anymore, but that's a habit that stuck for him, which is brilliant. But the one thing Joe Wicks told me that really stuck was that he designed those workouts so they could all be done in the space of, roughly the space of a yoga mat, because he grew up in a tiny, two-bedroom council flat. He had quite a tough upbringing, and he thought that, it made him think that if he was a child during the pandemic, he wouldn't have had anywhere to exercise. He didn't have a garden, so he wanted to make sure his workouts could be done within a very tight space, so anyone, wherever they lived, could do them. And I thought that was brilliant.
There's quite a lot of interesting research actually by Edelman, big PR agency that looks at trust, and they look at trust in the context of 2x2 grid. There's ethics and competence. So in order to trust someone or something, you have to see them as both ethical and competent. And in North America and the UK, neither NGOs, ethical, not competent, government, unethical, not competent, or corporates, competent, not ethical, fit in that box. And it's in that vacuum, I think, that, it's the same box, frankly, that Bono fitted in, Bob Geldof fitted in. In that context, North America and UK, we need people to come from traditional backgrounds and fill that void. But we haven't got anyone for climate yet.
No, so I was saying earlier, just you think of those different activist roles, and from the sports field, we don't have the same level of, eco-pioneer. It hasn't been taken up, and I think that there's a real gap there. I think it's more about awareness. I think the climate justice movement has brought attention to the disparities between the causes of climate change and ecological degradation and those who actually suffer. And sport is starting to wake up to that in response, and so we're seeing things like, you'll be hopefully aware of Forest Green Rovers, with Dale Vince, the owner, who's runs a renewable energy company, has created that, as a model of a sustainable club. It's been recognised by the UN. He's been engaged doing, similar activities with the UN globally. But the EFL in the UK have just launched this scheme, and you're seeing a kind of gradual wake up to not just the need to be sustainable, but actually the need to adapt to the way the world is changing, the way the climate is changing, the way the ecological conditions are changing.
And we'll see that space in the next 2 years change beyond all measure in sport. It will be one of the primary drivers, I believe, that FIFA won't get an every 2-year World Cup off the ground. And probably, ironically enough, one of the people that will drive it most, I think, is the current mayor of Manchester. It's a guy called Andy Burnham, who was at Fitz, and was a fairly rumbustious centre forward in his day. Liked to tell the referee what he thought. But if you notice, Andy Burnham had a cycling czar for his last 2 years in Manchester. It was a guy called Chris Boardman, who was an Olympian. Chris Boardman has left his role as cycling czar for Manchester. He's basically creating one big open cycling community in the centre of Manchester, many possible cycling lanes, shutting as many roads as possible, da-da-da. And Chris Boardman's just moved to run sport in England, grassroots sport in England, as chair of Sport England. So watch this space. If Andy gets any closer to government in particular, this kind of space is really going to change quickly. Last call, so think of your questions just quickly. I wanted to touch on one thing, which is what Dan would have wanted to touch on if Dan was here, which is around professional game. It's where he spends a lot of his time and how that's changing and evolving. And one of the things that's happened in the last year or so is the failed launch of a European Super League, by which all clubs in the centre of the largest clubs in England, apart from Tom's beloved Newcastle, sort of up sticks and go and play in Europe instead, which I think is a bit of a turning point for the way in which professional sport operates in this country. I don't think we'll see that again anytime soon in current form. They might extend European competition, but clubs, I think, even clubs of that size are going to need to reconnect to their local communities in very different ways to become more centre of those towns and cities that are going to need to change beyond all measure. and this kind of stuff, the changing evolution of professional sport, you know, that Gaza might occasionally have made the 34th story of the news at what was then 9 o'clock on BBC, but now the reason Dan's not here is because sport is now front and centre of the news agenda as well. And the truth of the Newcastle United deal that the Saudi Arabia's basically invested in Newcastle United this very week, it's partially about a good investment and soft power. It's partially also about the fact that Saudi Arabia has to diversify out of oil because, you know, oil's has a fairly borrowed time in this world, fortunately, and two of its big bets are in wind power and solar power, other forms of power, which, being on the east coast of the UK, is fairly useful in that regard. And it's a big investment area for Newcastle sooner rather than later, as is their freight and being close to one of the UK's biggest ports as well. So Saudi Arabia isn't just investing in Newcastle for a trophy football club. There's a lot broader political reasons for that, and it's just one example, I guess, of why sport is now front and centre of a pawn in a political game that, with the exception of a couple of Olympic boycotts, it just wasn't 20, 30 years ago, and that's the world in which we now live. Is that a good deal as a Newcastle fan?
Saudi Arabia have long been a trusted and valuable ally of the British people. Is that enough for you?
Very political, yeah. It's the only man I've ever seen get into Former Hall with his Newcastle shirt on, so we should probably... So, any questions from the floor? We've touched on all sorts of different stuff, from urban planning to health, education, to whether Saudi Arabia's investment in sport is a good idea or a bad idea. And there are hundreds of others we could have touched on. Does anyone have anything to throw in? Kieran?
Hi, I'm going to go right back to the start, actually. I was at college with Matt maybe a year ahead. I was actually captain of rugby here at Fitz. Since I've had quite an unusual life, I think. I've done 20 years as an energy lawyer, actually Ecotricity being a client of mine, and I can confirm that the vegan pasties at Forest Green Rovers are actually really nice, which was a surprise as a football fan. I then had quite a difficult time in my life, and I changed and became a teacher for 2 years, and I had a real perspective on sports in school. And one of the things coming out was that I kind of cast my mind back on these two careers, and as a senior lawyer, I recruited a lot of people. So I had to build teams, I had to hire partners and other lawyers to do that. And I stopped and I thought about what goes into those recruitment decisions. And it was never, is this person academically good? Are they good lawyers? Because you take that as a given at that level. What it was, what are their attributes? Do they work hard? Are they resilient? Are they empathetic? Can they work within a team? And I came to think, actually, these are all things that I didn't learn in the classroom. I learned it in school, potentially on the sports field. Now, the one thing that concerns me a little bit is that my observation in schools is that sports are being very much dumbed down. There's a lot of talk about, should children be allowed to head footballs? Is rugby too dangerous? There's very little competitive sport, to be honest, in most state schools now. So are children really learning to win, learning to lose? Because you can't build resilience by definition unless you lose. You have to lose and come back. Do you have any thoughts on that? Do you think sport is perhaps not doing the job it once did in terms of helping people to develop outside of the classroom?
So Kieran, for the benefit of people at home, if they didn't hear that, Kieran's question was, or I guess, are we overly sanitising sport and by virtue of taking competitive opportunities away from children, not giving them the opportunity to lose and therefore become resilient, which ultimately is what stands them in the best stead for their careers. Is that broadly right? You're not looking like you want to take that one first. Yeah.
It goes against the
Yeah, I'm not sure what the answer is to that. I mean, I just would say that I did most of the interviews in the book. We interviewed about 25 different people from coming at sport from very different ways, and so many people brought up nightmare stories about PE at school. It was just such a common motif. The phrase cross country came up constantly. Nobody seemed to like it. And people, you know, and this whole idea, if you weren't considered sporty at school, it was, you know, that was it for life. And I wasn't sporty at school. I remember being the worst person in my entire year at high jump. And when I finally jumped 80 centimetres, everyone else slow clapped. And I've obviously remembered this. But, you know, I think, it, you know, from the people we spoke to in the book, and we spoke to an amazing PE teacher in the book, and it sounded like things are a lot better now and a lot more inclusive. I think there are some children who perhaps don't want to play competitively, and that scares them off. My son does yoga in his classroom with his teacher. I think that's brilliant. So I guess I don't really know where I stand on that. I mean, I think maybe there's a healthy mix to be had. I don't know, Matt.
Yeah, I think my personal view would be that for those who want to compete, you learn so much from double 40 on match point down in my case, or losing as part of a unit and part of a team as well. And I know from hiring 200 grads in 10 years at Two Circles, what characterised those who we wanted versus those we didn't was not great A-levels and da-da-da-da-da. It was the emotional intelligence and a sense that they knew themselves and could engage with others in a really clear and credible way. And there was definitely a correlation between the ability to do that and having either, interestingly, produced a play or played any level of sport. The level was actually irrelevant in that. But the truth of it is, I think that the notion of losing in childhood now is somewhat moved away from. You know, it was very clear when we were growing up that A, B, C grade at GCSE or what was then O-levels was a pass and anything else was a fail. And you know, in a 1 to 9 environment, I'm not really sure how that works either. So, and frankly, I think some of the people we brought into the business who hadn't failed before was a real weakness of theirs, actually. So somehow, whether it's sport or anything else, for me, you've got to show your kids a bad day at the office.
As I said, though, I mean, in defence of inclusionary processes here, there is a balance to be had, and I think a lot depends on age, as to the extent to which you're trying to be inclusive and not alienate people who are neurologically diverse, let's say, oddballs like me, who felt really like hated on, but through the school sports environment, because it was highly competitive, and if you lost, you were a loser. You weren't someone to be supported. That's a difference between learning to lose, which I definitely did later in life. Not Fitz football team aside, but I think now I play young people at tennis now, and they're so much better than I am because they've actually learned to play tennis properly rather than mucking around like me. But I can beat them because they don't have the emotional intelligence on match point, not to double fault. And I think there's an emotional maturity that's needed for that, and actually putting that on kids too early and saying, go learn resilience at 6, you know?
Yeah.
There is a balance to be had. So, I mean, I defend, not just from my own experience, but the way I try and project my sport as well, and bring mentoring at younger sports people through. I played beach volleyball, and it's really important that, you know, that it's like the inclusionary aspect of the game is first, and not the self-anger when you miss a shot or letting the side down or whatever it might be. So
There is, I've seen a lot in my kids' state primary when they were still in primary, you know, the sort of growth mindset emphasis and, you know, learn, if you're not failing, you're not pushing yourself and that kind of stuff. I think it's done really nicely. But competitive sport, I agree with Tom, can still be a bit of a blunt instrument.
Thank you for the talk. Sorry, my voice is walking. But something we were talking a little bit about is sort of access to sport, and it was great hearing about Joe Wicks trying to make it accessible. But obviously, kids sort of trying to join a football club, they might have to pay for the kit, or like we said, what do you think clubs can do, or is there a role for governments and the public sector trying to make sport more accessible because of all the benefits it has for well-being and fitness and the like? So what can we do and what can governments do about that?
Yeah, we looked at this in quite a lot of detail in the book because, you know, what might be 60 quid for your kid's football kit and 10 quid a game or whatever you might pay is okay for some parents and not okay for some others. And, you know, if you look at the legacy impact participation after London 2012, it stayed static, but basically it stayed static, but the more underprivileged areas of Britain did less and less sport because the leisure centres shut and private gyms took up the slack. So it is not an equal playing environment now at all. And actually the single biggest thing that needs to change in this country is sport needs to have a proper role at governmental level. If you look at all our compatriots in Europe, look at Denmark, look at Holland, look at Ireland, health, education, environment, urban planning, all those departments of government have budgets and have strategies for sport in terms of how it fits in. We don't have any of that. A DCMS that sits on its own isn't a cabinet position. And so as a result, when you say government should be doing more, I wholeheartedly agree with that, because actually one more kid playing football is one fewer diabetes problem 15 years down the line. Oversimplifying, but you get my point. But there ain't the budget there. The only way we'll get the budget there is if we start to prove that £1 spent here is £3 saved over here. In the short term, what you're seeing, Tom whispered parkrun to me, what you see, why parkrun works, is a blend of three things. We called it the triangle in the sporting triangle.
Recipe.
Sporting recipe, there you go. You got me to change it because it was cooler. Sporting recipe, well basically it needs to be free and open, accessible, just like parkrun is. You can get anywhere in the country and in any environment, find a park and go and run. It needs to be free. It needs to be popular enough that you go without being pushed, because you ain't going to get any 10-year-old, 15-year-old, 55-year-old, God knows, you won't get a 75-year-old there if you're pushing them. It has to be attractive enough and fun enough, which is why the thing that works with parkrun is not the 5K, it's the social connection, the fact you're not allowed to have a parkrun unless there's a cafe there, so you can have a natter there as well, and so it's a really pleasant way to spend the morning. So it needs to be publicly accessible and free, it needs to be fun, but also needs to be underwritten by commercial support. So the reason parkrun's still free is because you have sponsors, like health insurance companies and stuff, picking up the tab. And that kind of a model is the way that we're going to have to work. And so finding corporates that are prepared, not for great glory or advertising whorings, but because they increasingly need to give back, just to put some seed money in to start some of this stuff going is completely fundamental. Otherwise, we've got to persuade government that £1 spent here is better than £1 spent in health or education. Right now, that's quite a ballsy play. Anything to?
Yeah, no, and it's the same globally as well. As I said, as green areas get moved out in cities, or it becomes more unhealthy to play, that's it's absolutely fundamental. And there are, you know, I played cricket when I was in India, and it was really interesting to talk to people there about the use of cricket pitches, like publicly available cricket pitches, and the hybridisation. So famously, the Maidan in Mumbai has this sets of cricket pitches, and a lot of other people are taking up the same approach, which is that you don't just play one game of cricket on a field that's the size of a cricket pitch. You have multiple games of cricket going on at the same time. I mean, God knows how people aren't getting, you know, put into hospital, but somehow it works, right? You have, you know, multiple strips that are closer together than a pitch would be, and you're actually getting more participation in competitive sport, rather than just, you know, cricket on the street and down the side alleys. You're actually getting people engaged in more formalised sport, but it's still cheap because you can, you know, layer people in. I mean, that's one solution, right? The other is provide more open spaces, and that pushback, I think, in this country hasn't really come yet to, as in, I think, you know, a champion to push that and to say to government, look, there needs to be an approach with government that makes a mass participation sports more easily available, accessible, free, but supported either through government or through sponsorship, through CSR, through, you know, Parkrun's done it through selling sport clothing to kind of subsidise the core costs of Parkrun.
And it might need generational change to support that and change the agenda in quite a meaningful way. Like, I despair of that conversation that happened 2 years ago where the FA was shouted down from selling Wembley in order to be able to build 30 3G pitches. I know they're plastic, bear with me. 30 3G pitches in every county in this country, open access for kids to play the game, fundamentally because the FA board in each region quite like the idea of still having their tickets to the FA Cup final. It's just so, you know, some structural stuff needs to happen, and that's where some regulation for football in particular I have a lot of sympathy for, which is just to cut through all of it. And on that bombshell, I think we're on time.
Thank you. Well, I would just remain to say to me, thank you first of all to the audience for coming, because we really appreciate you coming and trying an in-person event. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you've got any feedback, I'd love to hear it. Thank you so much to Matt, Tom, Kerry, fantastic, really interesting to hear from you. If you'd like to buy a copy of the book, Matt and Kerry will be offering to sign some. We've got some copies out the front. And that's it. So thank you very much for coming. See you all soon.
They're a lot cheaper, but just because you can't tell the publisher.
Don't tell the publisher.
And yeah, thanks for coming. I realise post-COVID and things, it's so taking steps out to be somewhere indoors in an evening is sort of you think twice about, but we do really appreciate it. And most of what makes writing books and coalescing your mates come down worth it. So big thanks.
Thank you.